We had that lecture from Sabeel Ahmad, and there were a few comments that I wanted to make about his presentation. The first, I always want to start with the positive when critiquing somebody, right? I think he really, and so I thank Zach also for giving me the opportunity to say this. So I think he did a really good job in painting um, what most Muslims really want, which is sort of an alliance of good people to stand against racism and bigotry. That Islam, generally speaking, in terms of its practitioners, is generally peaceful. And of course, there are violent individuals, but like any other community, that they're a minority. I think he really answered the question concerning who will get into paradise and who won't quite well. Um, and basically, I think that at the end of the day, um, his description of paradise and what it would look like really matched the Islamic sources, and I think he did a really great job of putting that forward. I think he also really explained why Muslims consider all the prior prophets to be Muslims and sort of expanding the Islamic history back to the pre-Muhammad period. I think he really nailed that piece of theology and sort of explaining it to Westerners. And I also think he really clarified the concept of Tawheed, this oneness of God, and the way that Muslims understand that oneness. That I've said that, there were a couple of things that he mentioned that are either historically inaccurate or might be accurate from a religious perspective, but not accurate from a historical perspective. And so the first one that I wanted to point out, he mentioned, somebody asked him about slavery, and he talked about how the Islamic world worked to manumit slaves and that Islam as a belief is about that. Um, I won't challenge the question of belief, but I will challenge the question of historicity. As we know, because we've talked about the Sakaliba and the Zanj and the Mamluks and the Ghilman and all of these other kinds of slaves that have been imported to the Islamic world, that Islamic empires did not preside over a large diminution in slavery. In fact, they increased the slave trade to massive proportions. They invented new and modernized ways of trading slaves, of moving slaves, of buying slaves. They created different functions for slaves, all the way from plantation workers at the very bottom to administrative functionaries at the very top. I mean, as we talk about the Mamluk Sultanates, those are cases of slaves who literally took over their own country. And of course, there's the argument that Muslims never had chattel slavery, anything like the U.S. South, which is false. We talked about the Zand revolts that took place in the late 800s, and those were revolts of black slaves who were on plantations growing cotton. There were other causes of that revolt that were not related to slavery, but the slaves did revolt against their masters in that case. Howard, did you want to add something?
Now, these are two versions of the same passage, I take it?
Yeah, that was the next thing I
Yeah.
was going to talk about.
Okay.
Because he mentioned the oft-repeated line from most Muslims, which is that the Quran has not been altered in any way over the last 1400 years. And that is proof of God's beneficence. In Arabic, they say, "La tataghayyar harf al-jar." Not a jot or tittle has been changed, if I can use the idiomatic translation. But we know from the early hadiths that there were 7 qira'at, or readings, of the Quran. And this is especially problematic because in Arabic, as you can see, a lot of words are defined by how many dots they have and the diacritical marks above them. Early Qurans did not have these. So different people would read the same word as 2 different words. And of these 7 qira'at, we don't know how many of those survive. We have 2 qira'at that have survived to the present day. The first one is the Hafs qira'at, which is used by the qira'ah, which is used by the majority of Muslims, overwhelming majority. Both Sunni and Shia will use Hafs. Warsh is used exclusively in North Africa by Moroccans, Algerians, and Tunisians. But the fact that we have these 2 qira'at mean that, of course, something has changed. Now, of the verses that are different between the Hafs version and the Warsh version, there are about 51 to 57 verses that are different out of a total of 6,200 verses in the Quran. So we're talking about a 1% difference. But it belies the claim that there's no difference and that the Quran has been perfectly preserved, because of course, which Quran has been preserved? Is it Hafs or Warsh? If either of them. Now, this particular verse, Quran 757, there's one word that in Hafs is rendered as bushran, meaning good tidings, and in Warsh is rendered as nushran, meaning um, to disperse or dispersing. So you can see that the English verse changes a little bit in terms of its meaning when you translate those words differently. The majority of other cases of differences between Hafs and Warsh are usually differences in who the verb is conjugated for, or whether it's a passive or active verb, things like that. Another thing that he mentioned was Islamic social justice and Islamic equality for all religions. Of course, we've seen throughout history that that's not accurate, that there are different legal statuses for different religious faiths within Islamic empires. It was certainly better than competing systems, especially under Christendom. But to say that it was anything like modern social justice is incorrect from a historical perspective. Another thing that was sort of blithed over was the difference between mysticism and how it applies to different sects and what the differences are between Sunnis and Shiites. As we've gone over in this series, there's actually a huge number of differences between Sunnis and Shiites. They originally start from those political differences, but then expand to the questions of imamate and the veneration of Ali and other theological issues. Of course, the fundamental issues between the sects in terms of warfare usually come from political issues like political repression or exile from the empires. And finally, Sabeel Ahmad mentioned a number of cases of the lesser jihad, or the lesser jihad being when Muslims resort to political action in order to defend the Islamic community, be that political action on the tamer side, such as protests, or on the more violent side, such as military conquest. And he put that under the label of a reaction to Western colonialism. And while that's certainly true, there is a reaction to Western colonialism that manifests in lesser jihad. We have numerous instances of lesser jihad existing throughout history where no Western colonialists or imperialists are involved because of its connection to Islamic law and doctrine throughout the ages. We've seen a number of cases of jihad already in this series, but one that we haven't seen, for example, is the war that the Saadians fought against the Songhai. It was actually a Muslim on Muslim jihad, but it was very clearly declared by the Saadians that the Songhai were takfiri or blasphemers, and as takfiri, they were subject to violence in a jihad. So I just wanted to make those quick points. Obviously, his lecture was very nice and established sort of a 101 base for a lot of people who are less familiar with Islam. But as we've seen, but when we come to these historical questions, a more nuanced approach is generally necessary.
Excellent, Rich. Thank you so much. And of course, tomorrow we'll continue, and then we're going to talk about the Sharia law. There's going to be probably a lot of parallels to the history that then you can draw, Rich, and then we can answer.
Absolutely, Sharia is a historical process, just like any other law creating process.
It seems to me that from your lecture and from other readings of the history, the Muslim world was not more peaceful than the Christian world. It does seem that all three of the Western monotheistic faiths did value peace in principle, but in practice, maybe not so much.
I'm not sure if it's an Abrahamic religions thing. I see it as much in the East. If you look at, for example, Southeast Asia, and I would advise reading, for example, about the mandala systems here, because that's really what's relevant. When the mandalas would overlap, you had numerous wars between Buddhist-aligned groups. You had wars between Hindu-aligned groups before Buddhism converted most of these Hindus to Buddhism. And it's just the nature of politics that groups will come and fight each other, and oftentimes you need some kind of religious legitimacy or theological legitimacy in order to justify why one group should be able to prevail over a certain piece of land, right? So
Yes, yeah. I think you're making my point
right,
that in practice, rulers do what rulers do. When I read from the Tanakh, the books of Kings, from the Haftorah readings from on Saturdays.
Mhm.
The part of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, that's not Torah, but the other writings which are either prophetic or of king's literature, which is of the royal courts. They're a lot like medieval courts, in the rivalries for the throne, and brother against brother, and son against father, and vice versa. I mean, it's really it's disheartening.
No, it's absolutely the case. Is that these are political entities, and as a result, you're going to see that kind of internecine strife, and it's unfortunate because a lot of people will vest their religious sense of purity and what they want the religion to be, and the religion may well be that, right? It may be an apolitical entity, but you can't then graft that onto the historical experience of these various empires, because that's just not the case, right? Um, so I think there needs to be a sort of reticence about what these empires were doing and what that means.
And it's, of course, it's a conflict between the ideal and the real.
Right, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And I think we also have to recognize that whatever the standard of the day is, 300 years later, looks monstrous. So we're here on Zoom. We think we're all smart. We're nice. All this stuff. Our great grandkids will think we're monsters in 300 years. So, I mean, I think there is a relativism that we can't forget. So.
Yeah. Now, on the other hand, you're dealing with warrior cultures, and the religion may matter to them, but it's not as important as killing enemies. In a sense, if you have a long, complicated religious works, you can usually find the quotes you need to justify what you're going to do.
Right. No, I mean, the thing is that, and this is sort of why I always find it hilarious when people talk about Sufis, and they don't know the historical context. Sufis marched at the head of armies. Sultans would routinely use them because the high nobles, aristocracy, and legal jurists, right, the Islamic legal jurists, the fuqaha, they didn't have, right, because they came from a very different class. The Sufis were poor, and so their religious fervor was seen as genuine by people. So it's
interesting.
So,
Rich, to draw,
yeah.
First of all, incredible presentation. I've thank you so much.